another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host, researcher, and friend, James Goad. And together, we're examining the very weird things that preachers say, the history behind what they say, and how it traces back through time to the latter rain healing revivals. James, today we have, I'm going to say it's probably one of my favorite, most anticipated episodes. We've actually been sitting on this one for a while. I let Charles preview this several weeks ago, and you and I were toying around with this idea because you had all of this research, and I was wondering, can we turn this into something that would appeal to listeners and help some people who are struggling with some of these weird things. So I let Charles preview this several weeks ago, and everyone that we've released so far, Charles is like, when are you going to release this one? When are you going to release this one? So we've been kind of, we're holding back a bit. Charles has been chomping at the bits, so I know today is going to be his lucky day. But we've been toying around with this idea for some time. And I threw, a few weeks ago, I threw a pilot episode out there just to see how people reacted, and feedback was extremely good. Like I was really surprised at how good it turned out. And so we've been sitting on this one for a while, and this one is one of the subjects that I'm going to say, even in the message, this fascinated me. If you don't already know it from the podcast and my little short videos, I'm very much a sci-fi fan. I've always been a sci-fi fan, even in the message. I was one of the fortunate ones that was allowed to read books. Some people in the message actually were not allowed to read books, but I was allowed to. They were allowed to read the Bible, of course, but fictional books sometimes is taboo in some of these cults, sects, and splinter groups. My group, and whether or not it was quote-unquote approved, I was cult royalty, being at the top of this thing. I was allowed to, so I read books, and I used to read a lot of books. I remember our house when we lived in Kansas was bicycle distance to the library, and I used to go back when they had these large paper grocery bags. I used to take 2 bags to the library weekly, and I would fill them with books, and I read constantly. I played music, and that's how that's most of my childhood. That's how I lived. But science fiction was fascinating to me, and my favorite book, one of my favorite books, was Ender's Game. I loved the book. The movie, actually not so good. I don't recommend the movie, and if you watch the movie, it's going to ruin the book for you. Read the book. I loved Ender's Game. It was great, and I don't know if you've noticed this. Some people have, but in every episode, I've got, and I'll point to it in the video version of this podcast, but right about here, I've got a picture of the Millennium Falcon, and it's in every one of my videos. I'll do a better picture because I think there's a glare from my light on the shield that goes around my drum set, but every video has the Millennium Falcon in it, and I'm still a kid. I've got all of these Star Wars toys and whatnot above my monitors. So I'm a big science fiction fan. But in the message, I separated science fiction from what I thought was reality in the sermons. Because, even as a kid, I realized that there's some things that you just really need to keep fiction. Don't blend it with Christianity, because what you end up with is fictional Christianity, right? And so I heard, I've heard from time to time these ministers talking about UFOs behind a pulpit. It was actually a thing in the message. Not many people realize this today because up until recently, it was kind of discarded and people realized, wait a minute, this is kind of silly. But as a kid, we heard some weird things that weren't talked about today. Believe it or not, UFOs is one of the weird things that is talked about in the message and the splinter groups and the latter rain healing revivals. And not just in William Branham's cult of personality, but this actually spread throughout the revivals. So UFOs, believe it or not, was something that, something that was talked about like openly in a religious setting, which is really weird. And as a kid, I just kind of separated the two because, no, man, this is nonsense. I'm not going to listen to this ridiculous thing unless it was, of course, William Branham that said it, because then I'm brainwashed, I'm programmed, manipulated to think whatever that man said was the absolute authority on Scripture and truth. So if he said it, I had to believe it. And there's where it made the gray area, because he said it and they're repeating it. But in my mind, I was wrestling with this. So I think for today's episode, it's time to pull on our tinfoil hats, because we're entering into, I'm also a big fan of the X-Files, and I can just see like, this is one of those episodes that is like the X-Files, and we need to put on our tinfoil hats and prepare for Agents Mulder and Scully to come investigate this doctrine that we're about to talk about.
It would definitely make a good episode of Ancient Aliens, if nothing else.
Exactly. Well, we've got a lot of research that you've worked very hard on compiling, and this is just one of many things that we have to get into, but again, it's one of the things that I really, really enjoy. I've mentioned my favorite book. One of my favorite movies is Independence Day. And I'm trying to imagine a minister behind the pulpit who is talking about Jesus Christ, who died on the cross for the sins of the world, and then trying to tie that to flying saucers in the sky, man. It's just so weird to me. And, even as a programmed, manipulated, brainwashed cult drone, I still thought this was ridiculous. And now that I'm out and I'm, my mind has somewhat cleansed all of this weirdness, I'm still like, I can't believe that they did this, man. It's just, it's just so weird. And, I think I need to pause and preface this episode and all future episodes. We're not picking on any particular minister. In the few that we've put out so far, I've had people contact me and say, who is that? Who said that thing? And I really don't want to give it out, because it's not really, in most cases, it's not really the minister's fault, because in these groups, in these splinter groups that sprung from the Latter Rain movement, these guys are literally parroting what either they heard as a kid in the revivals, or their parents taught them that their parents heard in the revivals, some of them directly from William Branham and his peers himself. They're just parroting these things. And I'll be honest, you can tell when you hear them say these things, they haven't really thought through it very well, right? So we're not picking on any particular minister. The clips that we've chosen, and we've got a lot of them, James, from your research, but we're not focusing in on the person. We're trying to focus in on the weird doctrine. And we understand, you and I understand, and I hope our listeners do, that it's not limited to the single person. This is just an example of something that we're bringing. But, this was a very common teaching. Again, the message has changed significantly after I started my website and videos, podcasts, etc. And a group of us have been, trying to reveal the history of the cult as it was birthed, as it transitioned into what it became. And that work largely has changed the character of the message and its splinter groups, because now ministers know that if they say something silly, we're probably going to talk about it, right? So we're not focusing in on the minister. We're focusing on what they're saying.
Yeah, growing up in these kinds of churches, hearing stories about UFOs and unexplained phenomenon around the world was quite common. there was a lot of things that was said by the prophet, and if the prophet said it, then it was real, and we had to figure out why. We had to conform our thinking to align with what the prophet said. So it's when you back these things up and you look at them with science and you actually look and see what actually has been done to explain some of these things, they don't seem as strange as you're sometimes led to believe. But this particular clip is quite interesting. How the UFOs seem to have something to do with the rapture of sorts. But I think it would be more interesting to let the minister speak for himself, and then we can look at it and see what we think about it.
Yeah. So let's play the clip, and again, we're not focusing in on any minister as we do this. They're literally just repeating what they have heard others say. So it's really not even their fault. So let's kick this off, and I hope our listeners enjoy the fun that we're about to have.
My goodness, all them, the UFOs everywhere. I wonder, friends, what's going on? The prophet said, don't worry about it, little children. One of these days, one of them's going to drop down. And he said there won't be hide, nor bones, nor hair left behind. But you're going to be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. Why? Because you remember Calvary. You remember Pentecost. You remember your word for this day. And Jesus says, I won't forget you.
Yeah, so that's an unusual quote, to say the least, James. It's really funny because historically thinking about this, there was a point of time I think it was in the 1950s, whenever the UFO craze hit the world, started in America and just kind of spread around the globe, and everyone was talking about this thing. And everyone capitalized on the frenzy. You've got the movie industry, the radio, the television, the books, and then the healing revivalists picked it up, and this became a doctrinal thing, like a fundamental rapture theology doctrinal thing back in the 50s. Well, fast forward through time, after the craze kind of fizzled out and it became no longer, I won't say no longer popular, because UFOs have always been fascinating, but it became less of a frenzy and there wasn't as much money in it. So all of these healing revivalists just kind of backed off, and they realized they were looking a little bit like fools. So it was no longer a doctrinal thing after a period of time. Well, now that we've got, again, this thing that's going on in the United States, where you've got all these military forces rising, and you've got, different technologies from different countries that we don't even fully yet understand, that are quote unquote UAPs now instead of UFOs. They don't want to to spark the UFO phenomenon again. But this is a thing. So a doomsday cult focuses on the unexplained because there's no way to prove them wrong. And so they'll tell their listeners that this is it, this is the end, the UFOs are coming. And that's what's happening here.
Yeah, and like you said, this really kind of got kicked into high gear in the 1950s. And one of the things that struck a lot of people's imagination was the 1952 incident where a bunch of UFOs, quote, appeared over DC. And a lot of reports went in. This went in the news. It went from coast to coast. Everyone was reporting on these multiple different sightings. And like you said, a lot of these ministers and all these different ministries picked them up and used them for their weird theologies. And, anywhere from Gordon Lindsay to William Branham. And it's quite interesting to see how the phenomenon of the time is used to wrap into these larger doctrines, and they come up with such weird conclusions, and then to see how it trickles down to today, and how people who are influenced by that and the things that they come up with and things like that, and how they try to morph it into the things that have been reported today and stuff like that. It's quite it's quite interesting. I'll say that.
It is. And, a lot of these men, we're talking about way back in the days of yesteryear. Charles and I went through some of the early history. You had like the Angelus Temple that had these massive, massive radio broadcasting antennas on top of the church that was, broadcasting to the radio and to the home. And that's what eventually transitioned into the televangelists, etc. It was an entertainment industry. And as we kind of covered in the show, it was closely linked to the Kardashian family. So this was heavily influenced by the entertainment industry. And a lot of these old timers remember back in, I want to say it was like 1938, Orson Welles took the H.G. Wells novel War of the Worlds and turned it into this radio broadcast. And, back in the day, back before television, all the families would gather around the radio box and they would sit and listen to whatever was the entertainment of the day. And they're sitting there expecting, the music broadcast or some of those old Western radio serials, whatever they're called. And all of a sudden, this voice comes on, breaking news. We've got the Martians have landed and they've attacked, and the whole nation went into this crazy frenzy because it was presented as, somewhat satire. It was science fiction, but to the average listener who wasn't expecting this, they're like, "Oh my gosh, the Martians have landed." And it went into this crazy frenzy across the United States. And so a lot of these ministers saw the power of this. And then whenever, this craze started hitting in the 50s, and like you said, there was a big event where it was military testing, but they started, this questionable thing. Was it really the aliens attacking? It was an unidentified flying object. UFO was the phrase was coined. And so there was this big question as to what's happening. Well, you had men like Gordon Lindsay, who was William Branham's campaign manager in the healing revivals. He started publishing this whole array of books on how the UFOs it was God's signs from the heavens, just as predicted in the Bible.
Yeah, and like you said, a lot of these things can be explained away with, undisclosed military tech, and we've had a lot of things from the, stealth fighters and things like that have one time been considered, science fiction, and then later on we find out that we have stuff like that. So it is not lost on me that a lot of this stuff can very well be explained away with, military tech. But yeah, but it doesn't stop some of these ministers from creating these strange doctrines around this stuff, and getting people in the frenzy of the unexplained. And that's where things get, interesting, and then sometimes even dangerous sometimes, depending on how some of these things go. And we've seen things go from harmless to as far bad as you can go. So it's very interesting to see how these things do influence certain movements and their trajectories and where they end up.
Yeah. And again, there's a strong element of fiction. It's not just the military aspect. There's some fiction and there's some crazy. It started out as quote unquote flying saucers. And historically, that's not even really what happened. There's this guy that noticed what he saw. I think he said something like saucers skipping on water, and the newspapers mistakenly thought that he said saucer-shaped objects. And so all of a sudden you had this frenzy in America. Oh my gosh, they're flying saucers. What are they? Are these aliens? And because the newspaper was printed like that, well, the military was working on something. And I don't know if the guy was planted or if he was just plain nuts, but he started a military, I think it was a colonel. His name was William Nichols. He got on the press, into an interview, and he said that the United States was investigating these saucers. And it's a good cover-up, right? If they are working on military technology and they have these quote-unquote saucers, now everybody focuses in on the saucers. What are they? Instead of, okay, these guys are building military tech. Is there a war coming? Should we be afraid, right? Well, it's interesting because that's flipped upside down in religion. While the government takes the fear away by shifting attention to something else, the religion flipped it back over and said, be afraid, the end is coming, the end is near, doomsday is near. And you had all these ministers who were just eating this up in the 1950s. And like the clip that you found, this guy's doing the same thing today because there's, again, this UAP phenomenon.
Right. And the strange thing about it is that it goes from the group that I'm familiar with, that I came out of, you run into these stories that, they're not just aliens and the end is nigh. It's that they're investigating angels, and they're here to bring judgment or beckon on the end of days. Yeah. And like you said, it gets into these really weird places, and it gets so extra biblical that you're like, are we even talking about the Bible anymore?
Yeah. It's pretty crazy stuff. So Gordon Lindsay published all of these books, and I think to some extent Gordon Lindsay is the one to blame for the origin of all of this, because he saw the power. He's the marketing engine of this healing revival through the Voice of Healing publications. And in October of 1952, he published this big front page of the Voice of Healing magazine. It says, "What is the mystery of these flying saucers? Are they of supernatural origin?" And, it quickly spread through the revival because they saw the power, the interest of this. And I've been studying ancient religion and ancient Gnosticism, how these pagan ideas mix with Christianity and form what they called the New Christianity. And it was very, very much like the cults of Dionysus and all of these other mystery cults. They had the mysteries, and the mysteries are what attracts the itching ears. You've got the people who don't understand what is true Christianity, but they want to know what's that mystery thing you're talking about? So they get all these people with itching ears come to hear. Well, once the frenzy fizzled out, again, they moved on to the next mystery because, well, that one's no longer a mystery. We know that that's investigating angels or whatever it was that each particular flavor of the splinter groups of the Latter Rain movement presented these UFOs as. And interestingly, this impacted Jim Jones and the trajectory of Jonestown. You can go onto the Jonestown Institute website and you can see some of that research that I've helped compile. But this was a frenzy that caught on, and it just exploded into this new quote-unquote rapture theology. And you find that it's almost centrally focused with all of the doomsday sects of the splinter groups of the Latter Rain.
Right, and it creates such an interesting concoction of tools for them to use because, you've got the unexplained, and that can kind of, like you said, get people with itching ears in to come in and see, well, what is going on? I'm maybe interested in UFOs. What's this got to do with your religion? And then you've got the more dangerous things where it's like talking about the end and the end of days, and the end is nigh, and there's all sorts of ways that these things can be leveraged, and they are leveraged in different ways. And like you said, and it starts from such a small, almost innocuous thing where, you've got some UFO reports, and then it goes in the news and flies around the country, and then one man spreads it in a healing magazine, and then you've got it influencing Jim Jones and all these other things, and then you even end up with things like Heaven's Gate, the UFO cult, and you're like, how did we get here? What's going on? Why are these things popping up? And it's crazy to think about how far some of these things go and where they feed into.
Yeah, exactly. And there have been strange phenomenon as far back as history records. And, even if you go back just a few hundred years, you see all of this weird stuff. Well, when modern Pentecostalism was birthed, it was birthed because of a series of earthquakes that happened in, I think it was Northern California. And you've got these natural events that have been occurring for millennia that you can find all through even the ancient world. You can find all of these events that spark some fear that the gods are angry, or as it relates to the latter rain, that the God is coming and the end of the world is nigh, that kind of thing. And now we have access to newspapers. We can go way back into the 1600s if you want. You can see all of these natural events that have been occurring for decades, long before these guys are claiming it's the end. And each time it happens, you find this new weird cult that emerges because some unusual, naturally occurring event happens, and the people just freak out because, again, it's the mystery, it's the unexplained.
Right, and there's there's even events that happened in 1954 in Chicago that Branham even picked up on. It was a weather phenomenon that happened over Lake Michigan, and it got put into message canon, and today ministers even pick it up and use it and talk about the event and how it's supernaturally unexplained, and how it's because the prophet said it was unexplained, and therefore it is unexplained. But the fact of the matter is that we have the science of today, and even you can look at the science that they were doing back then to determine what these things actually are. And we have satellites over the place, and we can examine all these weather phenomenon and actually get down and really figure out what's going on. And so maybe with that, we should check out this next clip and see a little bit about what's going on and see how these stories kind of progress.
You had a great sign to happen here in Chicago a few days ago. Jesus said in the last days, the waves would be roaring, perplexed of time, distress between the nations. What was it? Speaking of these tidal waves, never been known in all the history of the world. Ever tidal waves ever broke through like that until the last days. A tidal wave which is prophesied right from this platform struck Chicago right here and washed the people and killed up and down the banks of Chicago. No science can't even figure it out.
I listen to things like this, and not to pick on the minister, because again, he's a victim just like the rest of us, I'm sure. But he's not telling the whole story. The thing of it is, back during this time of latter rain, the whole purpose of latter rain was basically it exploded into a end of days theology because of the world wars. People took specific passages of the Bible where there will be earthquakes in diverse places, wars and rumors of wars, this kind of thing. Well, we had the wars, so now we have to have the earthquakes, and they reference, the San Francisco earthquake and whatever. Well, then here's this freak wave that just comes out of nowhere, and because initially there was an investigation, there was a mystery. Why was there this tidal wave? The leaders of this movement, they just rode that wave of hype. Science does not even know what it is. Well, that's true. Initially, science did not know. Now we know that this was not even an unusual thing, and this was a meteotsunami, I think is what they call it. It's
right.
A naturally occurring, it's a wave that occurs because there is a naturally forming event where the weather causes the surge of water, and the surge of water grows and grows until it becomes a little tsunami, right? So, these people, whenever they see these things, they leave out the part where, yeah, we know what this is. And they present the listeners with this great mystery. God is showing his signs on the earth as this wrath, which God could be, but there's also an explanation for this, if you know what I'm saying.
Right. And this is something that I was, when I was in a Branham church growing up, it's like you hear these things and you're young and maybe you don't have all the facts, and you look at some of this stuff, and your imagination just goes with it, and you don't have the facts to combat it. And so So yeah, you go along for the ride in your mind, and then if you're able to step back and actually look at the facts and actually see some of this stuff and actually look at how science breaks this down, the whether it's fear elements or whether it's curiosity elements, a lot of this stuff tampers down, because you're like, oh, well, that's explainable. It's not UFOs causing this, or it's not the hand of God. It's just the weather. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, it's really sad, because whenever you use fear as your tool to quote unquote save the people, they're held captive by this fear. But the problem is, once the fear is released, if they were only held captive to Christianity by fear, well, now that invisible barrier that's containing them into the cult mindset, well, now it's gone if there's no fear. So they have to find the next fear and the next fear, and just basically oppress and burden the people down with fear, because that's what kept the people in the cult. And sadly, this event that you're talking about, this tidal wave in Chicago, Chicago was the epicenter for the latter rain movement. Yeah, Joseph Matson Boze's church, Boze, who worked closely with not only William Branham, but several of these latter rain guys. He and A.W. Rasmussen were, two powerful figures in the latter rain movement, and largely responsible for its spread in the United States and around the globe. Well, Jim Jones, who, the famous Jonestown Massacre, the guy who he and over 900 people committed mass suicide in Guyana, they were a part of this thing. Jim Jones was closely connected to Joseph Matson Boze. Whenever this happened, William Branham, who was the leader of the post-World War II healing revival, he took the prophecy from Nahum. And if you read the book of Nahum, which is a very short book, it literally says in the first few sentences, this is a prophecy for Nineveh, not Chicago. And William Branham twists this around, and he says that great eagle Nahum, who saw Outer Drive in Chicago. I'll never forget the first time I visited Chicago. I'm driving through Outer Drive, and by this time I've kind of deprogrammed from the message cult. And I'm driving along, and suddenly that phrase popped in my head, this great eagle Nahum, who saw Outer Drive. And I'm sitting here, I'm seeing all of these, passenger buses and cars. I think it was on that trip I saw this very, very cool sports car. It was either a Lamborghini or something. And I saw this car going, and then I'm thinking back to Nahum's prophecy of chariots. And it's in no way, shape, or form, even resembling what Nahum was describing for Nineveh. And right. What happened was, because the people just simply didn't care. Nobody cared enough to go back and read. Remember, this was a scroll. It was not a book. It did not have chapters or numbered verses. It was a scroll. Start to finish was the scroll of this prediction for Nineveh. Well, nobody went to check on it. And Jim Jones became very scared that this was the end of days. And he started presenting this to his following, his cult of personality, that the end of days is coming because God's going to destroy Chicago, and he's going to obliterate the region of area where Indianapolis is with a bomb. Same things that Branham and others were propagating through the post-World War II healing revivals. And this deeply impacted Jones, and you could say that this was one of the first points in which it changed or altered the trajectory of People's Temple, all because of this platform of fear.
Right. And, that's something that is concerning for me, because, you see how some of these things have gone in the past, and then you look at some of the same things being used again by different people. And it just, it really makes you wonder, where are we going? Where are some of these things going? And, and I think that drawing a light on some of this stuff and really showing, that some of these things are not what they've been purported to be is helpful and useful for certain people. The more tools you have in your toolbox to investigate some of these things and look at what they really are and come up with, informed opinions rather than fanatical or even uninformed opinions in the slightest, it really helps to debunk and, come to a more rational conclusion and understanding of what's really going on in some of these instances.
Exactly. And earlier, you mentioned the Heaven's Gate cult, which for me is just absolutely fascinating. I know it's tragic and sad what happened, but it's just fascinating because here's this fictional theology. It's pure fiction, but they take it as theology, just in the same way the latter rain took the fictional events and turned it into a theology. Well, they, like many other branches of this doomsday cult, ended up to commit mass suicide because the UFOs are coming down to save us, and therefore we must kill ourselves. And in their death came their salvation. It's really, really weird when you think about it. And the Heaven's Gate cult I've not found any direct link back into the latter rain movement, but the leader was Marshall Applewhite, and he was working with his partner, Bonnie Nettles. Well, Nettles was from Houston, where you have Joel Osteen. Joel Osteen's father, John Osteen, was in the latter rain movement and heavily influenced through the ministries of Jack Moore in Shreveport, Louisiana. We've even got some newspaper articles where they're working together, they're holding revivals. I think his first tent was purchased by Demas Shakarian, who, the founder of the Full Gospel Businessmen International that William Branham worked with, the relative of the Kardashian family. So she was right there in this weird epicenter where there were all of these books and publications. We can't say that she was directly connected, but we can say that she was likely influenced because this would have been talk of the day. And anyway, these two connected, and they started spreading this thing and that attracted the itching ears, and the itching ears started believing it to the extent that they gave their own lives for it. So one of the things that I want to transition in the podcast is we focus so much on the tragedies and the weird history, but we want to focus more on the difference between this type of religion and what it's like once you get into the real world, if you know what I mean. And when your mind is constantly thinking of fear and this doomsday scenario, again, you've got these invisible walls of fear that's just holding your mind captive. And these leaders of these movements have been manipulated themselves to capitalize on that fear. And they know that when that fear fizzled out, they're going to lose half their congregation because they're held by fear. So they have to find the next fear and the next fear. And that burden and that oppression, it's like a train without rails. You don't know where it's headed. But in the real world, they're preaching Jesus is coming, which is a good thing. It's not bad to think on this. But they take the fear of that, and that's what holds the people captive, versus other Christian churches who aren't doomsday cults. Jesus is coming, and yay, it's a great thing. We're going to the other side. There's no need to be afraid, and there's no need to live in this fear and this bondage that's holding us.
Right, and it's so interesting because, like you said, the fear and the isolation that these things can bring. One of the things that I noticed from my time in some of these situations, I'll say, is that there's so much fear about the outside world and the things of the day that are going on and how they tie into prophecy and things like that, and it really isolates people away from the people of that group away from the outside world. And that's, as we know, is seen as a precursor to things happening that, like you said, go off the rails. But then they're isolated from the outside world, but they create an insular group that seems to provide them with the connections that they're missing from the outside in some way, shape, or form. So they substitute outside connections for more intense inside connections. And then this isolation amplifies and gets worse over time, and has in the past led to some bad things. And it's strange. And I even look back at some of the things that I was I was encountering in my time in these places, and yeah, it does, a war going on somewhere else across the world is somehow impacting you and your faith and the rapture. And it's all these weird things that get so far beyond the Bible and like you said, Jesus and it just, yeah, you're like, what are we doing? Is this church or is this conspiracy theory time?
Right. And the other problem, it's not necessarily bad to be close to the people in your church. That's a good thing. Church is supposed to be community. And if you look up the signs of what is a healthy church, you'll find that that's one of the things that is listed as healthy, if it is a community that is welcoming. The problem that I see with a lot of these types of splinter groups and variations of what emerge from latter rain is that they're not welcoming. They're very condescending to those who aren't of the same belief set. And so if you were a visitor from another church and you come to this cult thing and you're new, you don't know what it is they believe, and suddenly this guy on the platform is just railing you and every church that you've ever attended, well, you're never going to come back to this. And the people who are there, they see this outsider come in and they think, oh, they're being witness to the Word of God. When really they're just they're sitting through a bunch of insults. And then they leave and they say, well, they went out from us because they were not of us. And they're not realizing that if you really want to reach the lost, you want to save the sinner, well, you've got to speak in a way that makes the sinner want to join you, right? But these people get together and they get into this group mindset and this group think. And what happens is what could have been a healthy community, they become even hyper connected to the extent that it's an unhealthy level of connection where they're just right in each other's business. They want to know, are they sinning? Let's go tell the pastor. Or you'll hear these sermons preached at the people who are in the congregation. And, it's not a normal thing. But when you're in this group mindset, you start to see this abuse, this religious abuse, as a normal thing. To an outsider looking in, as the first time they visit, they're gone. They will never come back to this weird thing that, quite frankly, it's even stranger than the UFOs. Yeah,
and even like thinking back just a moment to one thing that you said about you've got the Jonestown and then you've got the Heaven's Gate. One of the things that I thought was interesting when I was looking at both of those was that both groups had a similar sort of they talked about the leader as though he's father or something like that, a more familial connection. And it is strange, to see both of those phenomena happening in two different groups that seem to be disconnected. But then, you see, like we talked about, the more insular connections and stuff like that. And it's just interesting to see these things from a high level point of view, just to look at them and examine them for what they are, and just to see, things that like you've talked about in other shows about, identifying things that can lead to destructive situations, though necessarily in a normal circumstance could be completely fine, but if they're introduced in an extreme situation can, get really bad. So yeah, it is interesting.
Right. And what you're describing is the central figure. People, when they have this unhealthy level of closeness and they've got a person that is leading them, well, suddenly this leader gets put onto a pedestal that no human should ever be put on. And as far back in time as you want to go, you can see this recurring over and over again, history repeating itself, to the extent that in the ancient world, in America today, we have this separation of church and state. But in the ancient world, it wasn't like this. You had the pharaoh or the king or whatever is the leader, who is basically the mediator between the god or the gods and man. insomuch that the people saw him as the deity. And whenever he died, there were a lot of ancient cities where the people would commit mass suicide in order to go to heaven or go to the underworld with their god, their leader. The Terracotta Warriors is an example of this. You've got the army of the Terracotta Warriors where all of the people knew that they were going to all die. They were going to commit suicide. And so they had somebody come in and start making these statues that represented each one of the individuals who killed themselves for the Terracotta Army. It's a fascinating history. It's tragic and sad, but whenever you take a person who is a human and you try to deify him in such a way that he is not human, take that all the way down into the churches. Whenever you take a pastor who's one of us, who, in the Bible, the same word for deacon is the same word used for pastor, which is a servant. When you take the one who's supposed to be the lowest among us, the servant who's showing us the way, and you make him now our controller, you've just basically deified him, and now you've created the scenario that can produce yet another splinter group. And it's tragic when you think Heaven's Gate and Jonestown, they're all potentially Terracotta Warriors. They can all enter into this scenario where they commit mass suicide.
Right. And going off that, there's I've even seen instances in some of the groups that I'm familiar with where there's this hyper focus on the pastor as the leader of the church, and in as far as you can't even understand your Bible, your religious text, without this person in your life and showing you how it all fits together. And so when all these things come to you that you don't understand, you're trained to be like, well, the pastor has it all figured out, or he will have it all figured out. And when I'm meant to understand, the understanding will be given to me.
So James, if you had one thing that you could say to our listeners, you and I both experienced different sects or branches of this, but we both experienced about the same thing. If you had one thing that you could say to the people who were once involved with this and now they've escaped this, and they're going through the process of healing, and they're going through the process of deprogramming from this weird stuff that's in our head, what would you tell our listeners?
Well, I would say that the best thing one of the things that helped me was just to honestly dig in further as far as research, and when things popped up and because you'd run across things as you're deprogramming that you're like, man, where did I come across that? And you start looking into it. And then for me, it almost becomes comical because I almost laugh at the situation that I even did believe that. And it's not that I'm laughing at myself for being down on myself. It's just the situation just seems so absurd. And I think the more that you train yourself to think critically, and the more you're exposed to critical thinking and just, actual facts that aren't just, manipulated stories and manipulated instances and stuff like that, it helped me, and maybe that can help other people as well.
My advice is enjoy the fiction. I enjoy the UFOs. I enjoy the history. War of the Worlds, I actually just saw the movie for the first time, I want to say 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago. I'd never seen the movie. I had heard the radio broadcast, and I knew some of the history, but it's a fascinating movie. It's fiction. It is a fascinating fiction movie. It in no way, shape, or form should be in a religious context. Whenever you merge fiction with Christianity, you get more fiction. You don't get Christianity. Fiction plus Christianity equals fiction. So my advice is enjoy the fiction. Take it out of the church. If you hear a minister try to blend fiction with your version of quote-unquote Christianity, ask yourself, are you really in Christianity? Because I can assure you that if they're bringing fiction into their sermons, they probably ran out of good, healthy things to say. And I'll just leave it at that. If you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. And for an overview of the historical research of William Branham and the healing revivals, read Preacher Behind the White Hoods, a critical examination of William Branham and his message. Available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.